Welcome everyone to Informa's Cell and Gene Therapy webinar from the Intelligence Division and Real Endpoints. This is part 2 in the series of discussions on advanced therapies, and we'll be focusing on the commercial aspects of this sector and the impact future medicines will have on patients, payers, and the biotech community in general. Before we begin, I want to remind you that you should be able to submit questions at any time during the webinar. We'll try to answer your questions at the end of the session as they're received, and if we can't get to your session before the end, we'll respond directly to you via email. Our panel for today includes Amanda Miklas from Data Monitor Healthcare, Steve Muntner from Strategic Transactions, and Roger Longman from Real Endpoints. Our agenda for the webinar will include first brief introductions for our panelists. Then Amanda will speak on the cell and gene therapy pipeline. Steve will discuss financial aspects including deals and partnerships. And Roger will discuss reimbursement and pricing issues. So our panelists. Amanda is a principal analyst for Data Monitor, and she's been tracking the pharmaceutical industry for over 10 years. She's a frequent author for Data Monitor and in vivo publications, and prior to Informa, she spent 5 years as a market research analyst for Purdue Pharma. Steve is the vice president and analyst for Informa, and is also a frequent author concentrating on financial analysis and in the healthcare space. Before coming to Informa, Steve worked for Natixis and Landenberg Thalmann in New York. Roger Longman is the CEO and co-founder of Real Endpoints and has been analyzing reimbursement and pricing issues related to comparative drug values and the implications for the future. He previously co-founded Windover Information, which published several journals and databases, including In Vivo and Strategic Transactions. And I'm Patricia Riley, Vice President of Business Intelligence Alliances for Informa's Pharma Intelligence Division. Previously, I was responsible for the content and management of disease coverage for several of Informa's proprietary databases. Prior to Informa, I was a research scientist and later a principal analyst in competitive intelligence for Boehringer Ingelheim. So we'll start off with Amanda's views of the current pipeline for this sector. Amanda and I recently attended the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine Cell and Gene Therapy meeting on the Mesa last month. So Amanda, can you start us off with some key highlights from the meeting?
Sure. Thanks, Patty. So as Patty mentioned, we attended the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine meeting last month, and to put things in context for this webinar, we wanted to share with you some of the highlights of things we heard at the conference this year regarding commercialization, pricing and reimbursement, and other topics. The overall feeling coming out of the conference is a lot of optimism and excitement about the cell and gene therapy field, but underlying that optimism was the fact that there still is a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure the safety and efficacy of cell and gene therapies, and to also ensure that patients have access to these products. We heard that there's been a huge number of IND filings to the FDA's Office of Cellular, Tissue, and Gene Therapies, actually over 200 submissions in each of the last couple of years, and out of these submissions, some breakthrough therapy designations have been granted. Looking forward, there is a lot of anticipation for the first cell-based immunotherapies to be approved within the next few years, followed by combinations, but off-the-shelf therapy is still a ways off. We also heard about the hope and potential for gene editing, which is a really exciting field right now within regenerative medicine, and one that has garnered a huge amount of investment recently. And even late yesterday, we heard reports of the first gene-edited cell injected into a human. But the hype around gene editing came with caution from leaders from the field who stressed the permanent nature of the technology and the importance of long-term tracking of patients whose genes are edited. In discussions on pricing and access to gene therapies, there is still a lot of concern with the consensus that pay-for-performance models, while could be manageable for smaller patient populations, especially for drugs that treat rare diseases, would be difficult to implement with the current systems we have based on the fact that patients are mobile and move from plan to plan, making it difficult to track them and their clinical outcomes. And later in the webinar, Roger Longman will delve into more details about pricing and reimbursement of cell and gene therapies. One of the key messages that we took away from the ARM conference this year was the need to link value and cost of cell and gene therapies. Understandably, drug developers want to see a return after working on the development of a product for many years, but the real focus should be on the patient and building into the clinical development plan the data needed for not only regulatory approval, but for other stakeholders to show the value to the patient and to society.
So Amanda, can you walk us through some of the clinical development considerations?
Sure. Thanks, Patty. So while the focus of this webinar is on the commercial impacts of cell and gene therapy, we thought it would be useful to touch upon some key points in R&D activity in this field, since R&D and commercial aspects go hand in hand. In the webinar in September, the data we presented focused on only gene therapies. And this graphic and the next few I'll show expand upon that, showing the pipeline for any cell therapy or gene therapy. And the main takeaway here is the sheer growth of drugs in this field. You can see that the pipeline of cell and gene therapies has grown steadily since 1995, and the volume of drugs across various phases and therapy areas has increased at over 10% between 1995 and 2016 through October. Some of the major approvals and launches of cell therapies and gene therapies are shown on this chart. We've seen cell therapies launched a lot earlier than gene therapies, and in the last few years we've seen the first gene therapies approved in the Western world, including Libera and Strimvelis. The current view of the cell therapy and gene therapy pipeline is pretty diversified in terms of phase, and while there have been failures, there is a lot of early stage work being done to help move the field forward. The pie chart on the right-hand side shows the split between inactive and active candidates, and the bar chart shows a breakdown of the pipeline by individual phases, as well as a current count on how many drugs have been suspended, discontinued, or withdrawn. There have been many past failures in the development of cell and gene therapies, with 61% of candidates logged into our pharma projects database as inactive. It's worth noting that the majority of these have been labeled as such because no further development has been publicly reported. But in the active pipeline for cell and gene therapies, there is an abundance of preclinical candidates, with over 500 in the pipeline as of when we captured this data. So the field is really being bolstered by early stage programs moving forward. Pretty overwhelmingly, cell and gene therapies in the pipeline are concentrated on two main areas, oncology and rare disease. For cell therapies, this is a shift in what we've seen for already approved products, which include multiple ones on the market for cardiovascular diseases or for musculoskeletal conditions such as bone regeneration. In oncology, though, we have already seen several launch cell and gene therapy products, including in the U.S. Amgen's Imlygic and Provenge, which Valeant acquired from Dendreon last year. Outside of the U.S., there are a handful of launched gene therapies and cell-based vaccines for cancer. Besides oncology and rare diseases, the current pipeline of cell and gene therapies are targeting a wide range of other therapy areas, such as metabolic and neurological diseases, although at comparatively much smaller volumes in the pipeline. In looking at the most active players in the cell and gene therapy field, you can see here that many smaller biotech firms are leading the way in driving the underlying technology. Many of the companies listed here, however, are partnered with large pharmaceutical companies that are providing the financial backing needed to advance cell and gene therapy drugs further and to provide the appropriate development and commercialization infrastructure needed for late-stage development and sales. Juno Therapeutics is partnered with Celgene, for example, and Selectus has teamed up with Pfizer and Servier. And concurrently, we're also seeing more technology collaborations between fellow players in the regenerative medicine market. And here we're seeing deals between Juno and Editas, for example, Juno and Fate Therapeutics, and Trexon and Diopharm are other examples. And later in the webinar, Steve Muntner will delve into more details about the deal-making climate in the cell and gene therapy field. Novartis and Celgene have also been active developers, and two have advanced cell and gene therapies thanks to in-licensing. Novartis recently announced that it was dissolving its cell and gene therapy unit and reintegrating it with its overall R&D division. The company did say it was still committed to developing its lead program in the area, a CAR T therapy, and would file it for approval in the US and EU in 2017. Novartis is currently in a race right now with Juno Therapeutics and Kite Pharma to get the first CAR T therapy to market. So while there is this tight race among these three companies, Kite Pharma recently announced some positive data for its lead CAR T therapy, KTEC-19, and has stated that it has a 12-month lead over the other two competitors. Based on the buzz at the recent R meeting, there is a lot of hope for the impending approvals of cell-based immunotherapies in oncology. So we thought it would be good to take a closer look at Kite Pharma since it might represent that first approval in CAR T. For some background, Kite is a fairly young company founded in 2009, so less than 10 years ago, but it's raised a ton of money in its short lifetime. Since it went public in 2014, the company's raised over $400 million through follow-on public offerings, and it currently has a $2 billion market cap. So the company clearly has a good amount of financial resources to put behind what could be groundbreaking work in the CAR T area. In addition to the financing it has received, Kite has also signed several key immunotherapy deals. In its first major partnership and one of the largest in CAR T to date, Kite and Amgen agreed to develop combinations of engineered peripheral blood autologous T-cell therapies, with the companies dividing the targets and each holding responsibility for development and commercialization. And that deal could be worth just over $1 billion. Kite has also teamed up with Bluebird Bio to bring together T-cell receptor therapies with gene editing technology. And earlier this year, Kite agreed to combine KTEC-19 with Genentech's approved PD-L1 drug Tecentriq to test safety and efficacy in refractory aggressive non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So the big question for Kite's CAR T therapy is whether or not it will in fact represent that first-in-class CAR T approval in the U.S. In late September, Kite released some phase 2 data that I think is promising for not only the CAR T field to help move this field forward, but also for the patient population Kite is targeting, which are diffuse large B-cell lymphoma patients who don't respond to the standard regimen of Rituxan plus chemotherapy. And this is where the opportunity for Kite's CAR T therapy lies. The data the company presented on KTEC-19 followed 3 months of treatment with the drug, and I think there will be more clarity about the prospects of its approval after the 6- and 9-month patient follow-up. But I do think that if those additional data continue to show strong response rates, we could see the Kite get approval for this product. Kite stated last week that it plans to start the process for a rolling BLA submission, potentially completing that by the end of the first quarter of 2017. And the company has also given some indication of commercialization plans and pricing if the drug is approved, and plans to offer the CAR T therapy initially at high-end academic centers experienced with CAR T and cell transplants. The company has also had preliminary discussions with several commercial payers and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and has indicated that the CAR T therapy may be priced along the lines of Revlimid, which costs $150,000 per year for 2 years of treatment, or Blincyto, which is between $180,000 to $270,000 for 2 to 3 cycles.
Great. Thanks, Amanda, for that really comprehensive overview of the clinical space. So, Steve, can you let us know what's currently going on in the advanced therapy deals, investments, and financial trends?
Sure, thanks. As Patty had mentioned, now I'm going to give a brief overview of what's going on in the deals in the regenerative medicine space. So when we're talking about deals in this space, we're looking at a combination of gene therapy, cell therapy, and other regenerative medicine companies, which includes the newer space of tissue reengineering. In 2014, we saw the space really start to pick up with nearly $5.2 billion. In 2015, we hit a new record with $11 billion. And 2016, while not as strong as 2015, is still looking strong. We had about $2.5 billion in the first half, which puts us on par for about $5 billion this year, which is similar to 2014. Now, looking at the breakdown of how these deals shape up, we looked at the public markets, we looked at the IPOs and the follow-ons, we looked at venture and private equity in the private market, we looked at pipes in the crossover market, and we looked at M&A and, of course, corporate partnerships. Now, what do we see as evidenced through the graphic here? The corporate partnerships that we're looking at here is only looking at upfront payments. So it's not taking into account those massive milestones or biobucks that we're hearing a lot about. However, with that in mind, we still see the corporate partnerships on the upfront-only basis being quite large, especially in 2015, where we hit nearly $2.5 billion in this sector alone. Also, M&A and public market activity, both follow-ons and IPOs, are quite strong. Now, this is within the broader regenerative medicine space as a whole. How does this compare, the question is, to broader biotech, and what are the trends that we're seeing line up between the two? So looking particularly within corporate partnerships on an upfront-only basis, ex-biobucks, we saw a CAGR, or compound annual growth rate, from 2013 all the way through our forecast in 2016, which is based on the first half of 16 actual doubled, at a CAGR of 95.5% for regenerative medicine, a clearly massive number. Now, that taken into account with the broader biotech space as a whole still had a CAGR of 22.6%, so still quite large, but clearly nothing so much that exponential growth that we're seeing within regenerative medicine. We also saw similar CAGRs, but not quite as large in other areas outside of corporate partnerships. Moving along, and now looking at the breakdown, specifically in the financing sector between the cell therapies, the gene therapies, and the newer space of tissue engineering, we actually see a pretty even breakout between the cell therapies and the gene therapies in terms of the total dollars raised since 2014 and in the forecast of 16. Again, we see the same trends, with 2015 by far being the stellar standout year, but 2016 still coming in strong, similarly probably ending about where 2014 ended. We also see the tissue engineering starting to pick up now as we move into the third and fourth quarters of this year. Again, going back to that CAGR and looking at the stat, specifically for the regenerative medicines, total financings, including both public and private, had a compound annual growth rate of 6.5%, still quite good. Whereas we looked at the CAGR for total financing in the broader biotech market, we actually saw a negative CAGR of 0.7%. So actually quite interesting when you're comparing to the broader biotech sector there. Moving along, now looking at the mega partnering deals and the M&A. As one would expect, the biobucks now taken into account and these milestones are quite massive. If you look at 2015, you're looking at biobucks of nearly $16 billion alone in this space. But obviously, that's yet to be seen if a lot of this will be realized. So again, back to the upfronts, and we still see the strong upfronts with over $2 billion in 2015 in this sector alone, and again, 14 being a little strong, and the forecast for 16, not as good as 15, but looking to exceed 14. On the M&A side, we see a similar trend emerging, except if we look at the breakout between the upfront and the milestones, or the earnouts, as we would consider in this case for our M&A, we actually see in 2014 quite heavy on the milestones, but interestingly enough, in 2015 and 2016, we see quite a pickup in the upfront payments, as evidenced by the orange and gray bars on the lower level there on the right. So this is very interesting and something a little different from partnerships, something to keep in mind as we move forward. Moving along on the public side, the IPOs, or the initial public offering space, we're looking at, on the chart on the left side on the bottom, a handful of some regenerative medicine IPOs that have gone public in the past few years. we're looking at the net proceeds, so that's the gross proceeds after removing the underwriter fees and any other expenses, so the money that's actually coming in directly to the company as a whole. We're actually looking at a mean and median net proceeds of right around $100 million, which is quite large, and with deals ranging individually from about $50 million on the low side to almost $300 million on the high side for the Juno Therapeutics deal. Now again, how does this compare to the broader biotech market? Well, the net proceeds raised across the broader biotech market in 2016 was around 50 to 60 million in terms of the median. So we see these regenerative medicine companies being able to raise quite a bit more, actually about double, than the broader market. So that's quite interesting there. In terms of how these IPOs that we're looking at here price versus their filing range, nothing really unique or interesting here. It's actually split about a third, and a third priced in the range, a third below the range, and a third above the range. So while that's not giving us any clarity into the regenerative medicine sector as a whole, what it's probably trying to tell us is that it comes down to the individual companies themselves, the quality of the management team, the quality of the products that they bring. So that is really key as we move forward here. Continuing along with the initial public offerings, the IPOs, we looked at the average and median pre-money valuations, and these came out at about 400 to 450 million. So again, quite large. This tells us that these companies in their IPOs raised about 25% of their pre-money valuation. So again, that 100 million figure being about 25%. Again, going back to the broader biotech market, it's quite comparable. The broader biotech market was about 27 to 42% of their pre-money valuation, so quite similar. But of course, the average pre and post monies of the broader biotech market were smaller because again, the net proceeds were smaller. So that's how, in turn, we get the proceeds as a percent of the pre-money to be quite comparable. So that's quite interesting to look at here. Moving along, what led these companies in order to do their initial public offering? They had to raise quite a bit of venture capital and private equity capital in the private market before going public. So again, we looked at a handful of these regenerative medicine companies. We really discovered some quite interesting facts in the space. So most of the IPOs for these companies were done only after the second round, or the V round as we call it, within venture capital investing before taking public. A lot of these were on a quite short time frame, maybe around 2 years or so, and a lot of the money that was raised in these individual rounds was quite large, often 50 million or more in some cases, which is quite a departure from the A and B rounds that we've seen in the past, which were quite small. Now also looking at the investor mix, that's also a very interesting thing that we take into account here. Typically you would see the venture capital and private equity firms that would invest and then exit potentially upon an IPO. What we see here is those companies still continue to participate, but we also see some institutional, hedge funds, and even more importantly, crossover investors. So investors such as, on the chart, Rock Springs, Cormorant, Ecor1, and Taston Capital that are investing now. And what it means to be a crossover investor is they're investing across the life continually of the company, spanning both the private and the public. So they're staying through the IPO, really showing their connection with the company. And that's something really interesting that we're starting to see within the market here. Continuing along on the other side of the spectrum, after these companies have gone public and completed their IPOs, the good news is we're still seeing them continue to be able to bring in fresh capital via follow-on offerings in the public market. So really what we're seeing is these companies bringing in additional capital generally within 1 year or within 365 days from IPO to first follow-on. Also, what we're seeing a lot of these companies is they're able to bring in as much, if not more, in capital in their first follow-on as their IPO. So clearly the appetite is still there and the investors are willing to invest in these companies. Of course, touching on the alliances and the milestones that we talked about before, we talked about the biobucks, and as always, these continue to be a large structure of the deal. However, you still see the upfront, and as evidence on the chart on the right side, we see this gray bar or gray line here, which is the equity. So what we're seeing now is licensors and licensees actually sharing a bit more risk or risk sharing via these equity payments. We're seeing a connection between the two payments because when you're buying equity, you own stock in the company and you're more directly vested in how it does. So we're seeing a bit more of that as well. On this slide coming up here, we're just looking at some of the main deals that have happened in the past 2 years, specifically within this regenerative space. Again, the structure between the upfronts, the milestones, and the equity. A few important things to note on this slide, as Amanda touched on before, we're seeing quite a bit of participation from big or large pharma in here. As you see Pfizer in here, Janssen, Roche, Glaxo, among others, that are being involved, really getting in now to these gene and cell therapy deals. Also, we're seeing quite a bit of repeat players in these deals. You'll see Juno, Kite, a few others multiple times in the space. So they're really starting to build a stronghold in these areas. Now what we're going to do to summarize on the public market side is look at a basket or a group of a few of these regenerative medicine companies that we looked at that went public in 2014 or 2015 as represented by the orange line, the IPO average, compared to the broader NASDAQ Biotechnology Index, or NBI, as it's known. The interesting thing here is we really saw a mirror image of the two lines from 2014 through the second quarter of this year, 2016. However, the really key thing to note here is we see an exaggeration in the gaps between the two lines. And what we see is when we see a trough in one, we see a deeper trough in the basket of the stocks than the NASDAQ. And then when we see a peak in the NASDAQ, we see a higher peak in the IPO average of these baskets. And then, interestingly enough, where we ended in the second quarter or first half of the year, we see these lines converge. So it'll be very interesting to see how this goes forward into 2017. Now, before moving on, we're going to do a quick case study on CRISPR Therapeutics. As referenced before, CRISPR Therapeutics, one of the entrants into the burgeoning gene editing space, we're going to look at the transition for basically a period of 2.5 years. Again, a pretty quick timetable here from when they raised their first Series A, or their first round, all the way through their recent IPO last month. So dating back to April of 2014, CRISPR received their first investment. It was $25 million via the Series A round from your typical VC versus Ventures, so nothing unusual there. Then jumping ahead about a year later, CRISPR actually added to its A round with an additional $35 million. So now we're looking at an A round of nearly $60 million, quite large, actually larger than some IPOs even. We're seeing some additional VCs participating here, so NEA and Abingworth. But the interesting thing is we're seeing corporate VCs participating as well, so Glaxo's SR1 and Celgene. So we see a nice mix there. At the same time, CRISPR is raising their B round, another $29 million from financial backers. So now we're up to $90 million in a short period of time. A few months later, fast forward, we're doing a $35 million convertible term loan from strategic Bayer. So very interesting here. Again, we see big pharma, Bayer getting in. Also, the thing to note is the structure of the deal, a convertible term loan, so essentially a debt instrument that can convert in equity later on. At the same time, CRISPR's busy forming mega partnership deals, two actually, one in October and one in December, which we'll touch on. The October one, including BioBucks, was $2.6 billion with Vertex, targeting a few areas, specifically cystic fibrosis and sickle cell, with the option to license worldwide rights for up to 6 candidates. Again, $75 million up front with that potential for up to $420 million or $2.4 billion in milestones. Interestingly enough, at that same time, CRISPR also entered into another convertible term loan, similar to what they did with Bayer, with Vertex as part of their Series B, this time for $40 million. Continuing along that same track, the second partnership that CRISPR entered was again with major pharma Bayer. Now remember, Bayer already has this convertible term loan with CRISPR. This time, for a joint venture, it's looking at blood disorders, blindness, and heart disease. $300 million for R&D funding for a period of 5 years. The interesting thing enough we see here is actually a multi-directional payment flow. We see the joint venture actually paying out to CRISPR $35 million as a tech access fee in exchange for obtaining the intellectual property for CRISPR's technology outside of the U.S. Now, in January of this year, we see both those term loans with Vertex and Bayer actually be converted. So the debt is being converted into preferred equity. So again, we're seeing an alignment of interest between the two parties, as now Bayer and Vertex both own stock and are personally vested in the future of CRISPR. Leading up to the final rounds of the IPO, CRISPR adds another $38 million in June, so now we're at $130 million total between the A and B round, quite large. At the same time, they're filing documents for the IPO. So October, the IPO comes, they price only $52 million, which is actually less than they had intended to raise, and interestingly enough, less than both the A and B rounds individually. Very interesting. But it was still well received, and at the same time, a $35 million PIPE again with Bayer, so big pharma investing even more. So what are the key takeaways that we see here, and what does this tell us about what's to come? So as always, mega deals continue to be milestone heavy, dependent on the future success and those biobucks. We see a bit of complicated funding structures with the alliances, with these hybrid of debt equity-like investments, i.e. the convertible debt that we see, corporates investing alongside of your typical venture firms. Again, the multi-directional payment streams in the alliances, which you saw in the joint venture paying out to CRISPR, high level of participation from the corporate VCs, the convertible debt again, as well as the simultaneous use of multiple financing methods at the same time, aka the IPO and the concurrent PIPE.
Thanks, Steve, for that very in-depth view of the current trends in financing. It's really interesting to see the types of investors that are involved in the funding strategies that are being employed by these new companies. Roger, the pricing of cell and gene therapies will no doubt present challenges to the industry and to payers. Can you walk us through the issues and the considerations affecting pricing and reimbursement for the advanced therapies field?
Sure. I guess the question is really how different is, from a payer's point of view, is gene therapy from other orphan or niche indications? And the answer is it's similar and it's different. Amanda and Steve have gone through just how much activity there is going on. And there's lots of it, and we don't have to review it now. The challenge, if there is sort of a difference here, the challenge is how do you pay for something that is curative and that probably will build into the price the value of what were chronic medications. That's not easy, and we don't really have the mechanisms to do that yet. So, if I think about this world, what's happening now, what's going to happen in the medium term, and what's going to happen in the long term, the first thing to note is that most payers have no clue what's going on with gene therapy and don't care. Most payers have a maximum 2-year view of what's going to be on the market. They're concerned about really big categories that are coming, and gene therapies, by and large, don't fit into them. And if there are folks in the pharmacy departments who are watching it, they have gotten no direction from their bosses and upper management. So what's likely to happen early on is there's going to be no real new rules. They're going to be handled on a case-by-case basis. Over time, as these therapies come onto the market in greater volume, there is going to be a recognition by the senior guys at the payers that something's got to be done, that these expenses are too much, and there's going to have to be some construct in which to deal with them. Now, I do know that a number of folks are talking with payers now, but they're not really talking at the right levels because the folks who are kind of making decisions on other drugs have a pattern for doing that, and they haven't really focused on some of the key bigger issues that are going to be important to financing these kinds of payments. So first thing is, let's look at what's similar and to what exists today. And the first thing to note is that if you've got a drug or a therapy that cures a disease, particularly if the disease has a kind of emotional content to it, payers are going to pay for it. It's just sort of no question. They paid for all sorts of orphan diseases, orphan therapies now at very, very high rates. And I've just put a few quotes here to give you a kind of payer's point of view. But even when drugs are very expensive, and even when they don't really work all that brilliantly, you see these kinds of, I've got to do this, I can't avoid it. We just got bullied into approving an unnecessary oncology treatment for Mass General. The whole issue is incredibly political. They just can't say no. Certainly the lesson from Kalydeco, the CF, the follow-on CF therapy from Vertex was the same, even though it doesn't work nearly as well in the same percentage of people as its predecessor drug did. Most payers are just paying for Kalydeco. It's just done. Where there's beginning to be some pushback is when there is more equivocal kinds of data, like Exondys 51 from Sarepta in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, where a number of payers said yes, Aetna did, Cigna did. I think United was still a little bit on the fence. But Anthem said, no, there's just not the data to be able to pay for this. The interesting thing is what will happen in that case in competitive marketplaces. So, for example, Anthem competes in New Hampshire with a couple of smaller New England plans like Harvard Pilgrim. Harvard Pilgrim is paying for Exondys 51. Well, Anthem is not paying for it. That puts Harvard Pilgrim at a significant financial disadvantage and will push Harvard Pilgrim to perhaps say no. It's still unclear what's going to happen, but the more these situations come up, the more competition is going to change how people react. So what are likely to be the mechanisms that pay for these therapies? The first one most people are talking about are annuity payments. There's also a lot of discussion about a national fund. And then there's finally some people who have been thinking about debt financing. So let me take each of these in turn. The annuity payment is probably is the one most people say is likeliest. The idea is to spread the costs out over time, and if possible, to do an outcomes or a risk-sharing agreement between the pharmaceutical company and the payer. There are some downsides to this, which I'll get to, but it seems to be the least complicated and least painful way to go. The national fund idea, sort of like the vaccine fund, the Zika fund, is also an interesting idea and sort of gets around the notion that payers only have a patient for only a few years, and therefore don't want to take on the entire burden of funding such a potentially hugely expensive therapy. And I guess I should say that people do think these therapies are going to be, the curative therapies are going to be extremely expensive, $500,000 to $1.5 million. The issue is that no one payer wants to take on that whole cost. It would be, if there were a national fund for what are essentially rare diseases, in these cases, that would certainly help. The government would, in effect, be able to subsidize. And it wouldn't actually be the government. It would probably be most payers would pay into a fund in the way that pharma companies pay into the vaccine fund. And so the cost would be spread out, but through a kind of governmentally managed instrument. And the final idea has been debt financing. where the debt is, where the price is effectively a loan to the payer or even to the patient and paid out over time. It's just, there's almost no way that's going to happen. Let's then look at the annuity payment, the likeliest option here. This seemed to me 2 weeks ago to be the most straightforward. The problem is that I no longer understand how the federal government, the change in with the Trump administration coming in, how that will work. If you think about Medicare, it had, at least under Obamacare, a mechanism to experiment with things through the CMMI organization. If Trump is to be believed, a lot of that is going to go away. So what do we think of in terms, how likely is Medicare going to be experimenting with these things? It seems to be less likely. So the notion that Medicare will be able to respond creatively to these new therapies, it's just up in the air. I just don't understand how that's going to work, and we're going to need to see what shakes out over the next year. On the other hand, I should also say that Medicare is probably not the most important payer in this world. My bet is that for most of these patients, it will be Medicaid or commercial plans. Most of these patients are going to be younger or impoverished. With Medicaid, again, we really don't know because decisions are made on a state-by-state basis. On the commercial side, here are the challenges. Well, here's the opportunity. It would be really cool to be able to set up staggered payments. Those staggered payments could be, there could be an agreement between the payer A, who has the patient, and payer B, who does not yet have the patient, so that payer A would be responsible somehow for that payment, and he would continue to pay. But he would have to involve payer B in that. That's a complicated situation. The second issue is that, or the second possibility is some sort of sharing between payer A and payer B. That's going to be awfully challenging. I'm not sure how that gets done, largely because there's a bunch of antitrust stuff that could get in the way of those discussions. Finally, one other challenge with all of this is the accounting rules. One of the arguments for an annuity payment or an annuity style payment is that it can spread out the cost to a plan over time. The accounting rules, however, don't allow that. What they basically say is if you have to take that expense up front, even if you're not paying out the cash up front. The problem there is nobody likes to take that big kind of expense up front, so you'd have to change the accounting rules, and God knows whether that's going to be possible to do. So, the next issue here, and the final issue that I want to talk about, is the issue of outcomes-based contracts. So, it would be most sensible for these companies to be able to say, I will continue to pay for this therapy or pay these staggered payments for this therapy as long as it continues to work. That makes sense. The issue for all of these contracts is are laid out in the slide. If there's a measurable outcome to track, you can actually sign such a contract, and there usually is in most of these gene therapies. Is it manageable to track the population? One of the problems with outcomes-based contracts for high volume patient populations is that it's very difficult to track those large numbers of patients. But in this case, since most patient populations are pretty small, it's relatively straightforward. All of these outcomes-based deals are expensive to track, expensive to the payer, and they would like to pass that cost on to the manufacturer. If they can't pass it on to the manufacturer, it has to be at the payer's expense. The payer, therefore, has to say, is it worthwhile to do it? Is there significant enough budget impact on the plan to make it worthwhile to set something up? And by significant, I mean noticeable to the plan's P&L. And one way we look at that is if there is a significant, is that such an impact is kind of greater than 0.5% of total health expenditures. Most plans would kind of see it that way. Finally, it would be helpful if, for these kinds of deals, if the outcomes were variable. That is to say, if you knew what the outcome was going to be, if it was 100% every time, you don't have to worry about them. But virtually all of these are going to work in some people and not work in others. The more variable they are, the more important they will be to track. That's about all I've got to say about pricing. It's a challenging issue. We just don't know enough about what's going to happen, and we won't know enough until we see more of these therapies approved. So I'll throw it back to you, Patty.
Thanks, Roger. It's a really good perspective on just how complicated this whole, all of these issues are, and how everybody in the community is going to have to try to get a handle on and get some resolution to these as soon as some of these therapies really get going. So we still have time now for questions, and we do have questions here. I'm going to take the first one. This one is for Amanda. And basically, the question is, within the cancer space, are pipeline drugs focusing on any particular areas, solid tumors or blood and lymph tumors?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the slide that I showed showed the therapy areas at the top level, and you could see that cancer was the lead therapy area. There's actually a lot of overlap between cancer and rare diseases, since a lot of the cancers being targeting are themselves rare diseases. So if you look at the entire pipeline of cell or gene therapies, you'll see a lot of solid tumors being targeted, including pancreatic cancer and liver cancer at the top, as well as other cancers like melanoma, breast, colorectal, ovarian. But if you actually just look at the pipeline specifically for ex vivo gene modification, you'll see that the majority of cancers being targeted in just that subset are actually for hematological tumors. So, and looking at the overall pipeline, you'll see more solid tumors. But if you just break out the ex vivo gene therapies, the gene modification of cells, you see more of them for hematological tumors.
Great, thanks. The next question we have is for Steve. It's a long one. What are your thoughts looking into 2017 specifically regarding whether or not the IPO window will continue to remain open, and predictions on the level of public market activity we should expect to see?
Yeah, well, thanks for forwarding that question along, Patty. I'd be happy to answer it. So I think in order to look forward, we need to recap and look back a bit at the same time. So a couple things to look at. First, if we look at the number of IPO filings and the pricings, I would say that happened this year versus the past. That will give us an indicator of what's to move to the future. So just looking in general across all sectors in terms of IPO filings this year, we saw about 117 filings, which is relatively low compared to the past few years. We saw 234 and 363 filings in the years past. So definitely trending down a bit there, but there's still activity there, so that's a good sign. But that's down about 48% just year over year. But keep in mind, again, 2015 was a very big year there. Similarly, with the pricing, is also down about 41%. So we had about 96 deals priced at this point in the year versus 163 last year in the broader market. Now, the good news there is 40 of those 96, so about 40% actually even, were in healthcare, the broader healthcare space. So that's good news that healthcare is a strong part of this sector and moving in that direction. I think really what we have to think about also, so in the third quarter, we also had a pretty strong quarter with 33 deals in total for about $6.1 billion in the broader IPO markets pricing this past quarter in general. I think what we need to think about moving forward into 2017 is a few things. One, there's political uncertainty, as Roger had mentioned, so no one knows how that's going to play out. But secondly, I think it is evident that the IPO window is still open. It's been open for a period of time. The question is, and has always been, those companies that are producing solid and positive trial results and are good companies will clearly have no problem moving forward and getting the finance they need, whether it's in the public markets, the private markets, however they see that. Other companies, is yet to be seen if that market remains open. But I think for those companies that are continuing to deliver, I think they're going to have no problem getting, money in the markets. I also think that maybe we'll see some approvals for CAR T continuing into the new year. So that will be helpful. And if we see that, just kind of like how Roger was saying, how payers will have to pay on that side, I think investors will have to invest, and they'll be more than willing to based on the future of this technology.
Thanks. Well, we have one for Amanda that actually picks up on that CAR T theme. So besides the Kite program, what's the status of the other leading CAR T therapies in the pipeline?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we talked about Kite Pharma's candidate, which could apparently be the first CAR T approval, first filing and first approval in the U.S. The other two CAR T therapies from Novartis and Juno are also both in phase 2, and they too are targeting tumor cells that express CD19. Now with Novartis, in September it said it was shutting down its cell and gene therapy unit, but made a point of saying that it is still advancing its lead CAR T therapy, CTL-019, which it has developed under collaboration with the University of Pennsylvania. And again, in the pediatric acute lymphocytic leukemia indication, Novartis is still planning to file for approval in the U.S. and EU in 2017. And it actually has breakthrough therapy designation in the U.S. and PRIME designation in Europe, which are accelerated approval pathways. Then with Novartis, also an interesting case, its candidate, JCAR-015, which is in phase 2 also for ALL, but in adults, the FDA put a hold on its trial in July after 3 people died from cerebral edema apparently caused by the addition of fludarabine to the preconditioning treatment used before the engineered T cells are put back into the patient. So Juno amended the protocol, removed the fludarabine, and the FDA lifted the clinical hold actually shortly after the hold was put on it. But Juno has now said that it doesn't expect approval until 2018 because of the delay. So we have Kite Pharma apparently completing its BLA by the end of the first quarter of next year. We have then Novartis filing for its CAR T therapy sometime in 2017, and then Juno saying that it's not expecting approval until 2018. So that's sort of the order right now of those 3 competitors.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have another long one, Steve. Has Q3 continued the pattern of mega partnering and M&A in the space, and what in particular have we seen that could be used as a leading indicator for future deal activity?
Sure, Patty. Thanks for that question. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk to that. So yeah, obviously we've seen a lot of these mega deals again with a combination of upfronts, again with the big bio docs, which we'll see, yet to see if those will be realized or not. I think it's clear that on some level we're definitely going to continue to see some of these mega deals, the alliances and the M&As as well, because there's a lot of interest in the space. So I think that's clear. And moving forward, just to highlight some of the very recent deals, actually it just happened in the third quarter to show that this is continuing. We had Bluebird inking a collaboration that included R&D and licensing with Medigene, valued at nearly $1 billion for their T-cell receptor immunotherapy program. We also had Takeda with Tygenix, nearly 350 million euros on an ex-licensing deal. And we had Ono with Ciliad on an NKR2 T-cell therapy program, ex-US rights, about 280 million euros in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. On the M&A side, we also had some big deals. We had Allergan acquiring RetroSense for about 60 million, and Pfizer acquiring Bamboo for 650 million. So quite large. So I think these will definitely continue. Some interesting things we've seen, first of all, with the Takeda Tygenix deal and the Ono Ciliad deals, those are both ex-US rights. So particularly Ono Ciliad is Asia, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. So we're seeing a pickup there. While up until now, obviously we've seen a lot of cell and gene therapies take place in the US and Europe. We're seeing a lot of these foreign companies and these foreign licensing deals happening and the rights there. Interesting, like the M&A and the partnering is continuing to move along, as is the public markets. Now, historically, in the broader market, you've seen the public markets, the IPOs and the M&As, been more inversely correlated because one or another is typically an exit for your VC firms. But what we've been seeing as of late, and not just within cell and gene therapy, but the broader market, is that these two seem to actually be positively correlated. So they're continuing. So the question is, if the IPO window does start to close or shrink a little bit, will M&A or partnering pick up even more? And that's something that remains to be seen. But I think similarly to on the public market and the IPO side, for those good companies that are out there that are, again, continue to have those positive clinical trial results, and the approvals and stuff, I think that there's definitely good opportunity. So I think we definitely will see a continuing in 2017. I think actually 2017, in my opinion, may be a bit stronger than 2016. Maybe not as strong as 2015, which was a banner year, but I think we're still on track, and I think it's going to be good looking forward.
Thank you. Well, that's pretty much all the time we have before we wrap up. I really wanted to thank Amanda Miklas, Steve Muntner, and Roger Longman for their expert analysis in all these different areas within the cell and gene therapy sector. And we hope you enjoyed the webinar. If you want any more information, please email the email address that's on the screen. And we hope you'll join our next webinar whenever we have one scheduled. So thanks very much.